Well, for some of you, that might be a first ever glimpse of the island of St Helena. 2 days ago, I got my first ever glimpse in person, having a look at a space that I knew fairly vaguely, if I'm honest. I knew from the history of Napoleon, albeit not in detail. I knew from one or two magazine reports that I've read, and I kind of had this sense that it was this distant, remote island with intrigue and allure and somewhere that I really wanted to visit. And so that is exactly what I am doing this week as a guest of both Airlink and St. Helena Tourism. And so today's episode of Dan Really Likes Wine, brought to you by Norman Goodfellows, comes to you from the home, the very last home of a rather well-known Frenchman called Napoleon Bonaparte, who spent his final 6 years here after being, depending on the term you use, exiled, ejected, kept here because of his global fame. And this is where he lived out his final days. Now, as an historical figure, he is as big as they get. He had a massive, massive influence on Europe as he built up his empire and gave the world so much as one of the most extraordinary people of his time, a man who did everything he did until the age of 45, which is when he found himself on St. Helena. And so purely from an historical perspective, having a conversation about him would be fascinating. But how, you might be asking, does that plug into a wine show? Well, amongst the many things that Napoleon Bonaparte did here to pass his time, including gardening in his later years, he was a lover of wine and drank wine from Madeira, drank wine from France, and discovered through Groot Constantia a love of the wines of Constantia. And the legend has it, and we'll check in with the most noted authority on Napoleon in a moment, that he drank a bottle of exactly this, the Grand Constance, this one here, or a version thereof, in his daily regime. A bottle a day, well, it's not the biggest bottle. If that's the size of the bottles, then I'm not sure, but it is a link that has been spoken about all over the world, and that follows on this train of the sweet wine of Constantia popping up in both history and literature. Think the works of Jane Austen, or the works, if you prefer, of 50 Shades of Grey. There is this story of the sweet wines of Constantia. And it wasn't just historically Napoleon, it was King Frederick of Prussia, it was Louis Philippe in France, it was many people who loved this particular wine. So what exactly made it so special? How did it find its way to this island? And how has it evolved into a really big part of the South African wine story today, with not just the Grand Constance, but also the Van de Constance of Klein Constantia? We have both winemakers on the show a little later on today, Danie at Groot Constantia, Matt at Klein Constantia, and we'll be catching up with them a little later on the show. And then we also have His Excellency, the French consul of St. Helena, with whom I've just enjoyed a lovely lunch and a very nice bottle of 2016 Governor's Reserve White over some super food. And Michelle, who's been taking me on a tour of Napoleon's house and giving me a sense of the history of both the man and his time here, will give us the wine angle to this particular story, and a fascinating one it promises to be. We have the wine poured and we're ready to try it, discover it, and find out just why it had such a big impact on one man on one island. But before we do that, let's have a quick look at some wine news. Oh, this is, you look at the Grand Roche, they've had a difficult time over the better part of the last decade, and principally around COVID, closing down, reopening. Peacock Wood was there for a while, but now it looks like they're back on their feet. There's a new menu, there's a new team on board. It is one of the iconic properties of the winelands out in Paarl. I've said there a number of times over the years, it has never been anything less than enchanting, and it is now your opportunity to do likewise, whether it is staying there or going in to try not just the food, but a wine list that has always been superb. You can go and spend some time out in Paarl and do so at one of the great properties of the wineland. So looking good, looking new, looking exciting, and ready to bring you in, whether it's a stay over or a meal and some great wine, worth having a look at that for somewhere special. Then some good news to the team at Boschendal. They've been doing some really good work. Andrew Harris and his team from a marketing department, spreading the gospel of some wine that's backed up by some really good winemaking. Jacques Villiers has got a sure touch and an exciting one, and he's brought us some really good wine with his team of winemakers over the last few years. And as you can see from the awards on screen there, the bubbles in particular getting some really good recognition. They put a lot of time and energy in. The Jean Long is now 9 years on the lease, which is giving you something so aged and so rich and so full of the history of nearly a decade coming to you. It's part of what's been a real change in approach in our bubbles industry over the last while, really looking at the premium element of it and aging wine properly. And I think that recognition for Boschendal is not just great for Boschendal itself, but also yet another recognition of how well we're doing in getting our Cup Classique offering just right. And speaking of Cup Classique, Daryl Robertson will be back up in Johannesburg, her Champagne Cup Classique Festival. This will be the 17th and 18th of May. That's right, 17th and 18th of May. Daryl bringing in well-known brands, both Cup Classique and Champagne, but also every year there are a couple of Cup Classiques that even I'm not entirely sure I've heard of. And that is part of an industry that's in a really exciting space. So just as people like Boschendal are lifting that premium aspect of bubbles, so also giving the bubble space the chance to grow and flourish with new producers. And that puts a smile on all of us who get to drink them. So look out for that coming up in Inanda, 17 and 18, evening on the 17th, day on the 18th. Loads of bubbles and a great couple of days in store. All right, well, welcome to St Helena. I have to say, the team here, Matt, Joshua, and his tourism group have been fantastic, but also the people have been almost suspiciously friendly. I don't think we've ever been welcomed quite so warmly. And Michelle, you are no exception. Thank you for having us here and for welcoming us in and giving us such a great tour of what is such an important spot in the history of St Helena. Tell us where we are and how this plugs into the story of Napoleon.
So we are in Longwood House, the house where Napoleon spent his last years, and it is on the southern side of the island, on the top of plateau, high, 600 meters high. And the reason that we are on front of a glass of wine is because, of course, Napoleon had to adapt to his exile, which is not an exile as we have discussed. And he did some gardening, he loved his veggies, but he also loved his wine. So Napoleon was mostly a Burgundy amateur. But he didn't dislike some Claret and some Bordeaux. But when he was on St Helena, on those days, the Burgundy traveled very badly, crossing the equator for Burgundy wine. For some of them, maybe the specialists will know. But it is something that it has been proved that Burgundy did travel very badly at sea, while Bordeaux wine did well. But anyway, they had to find some substitute to Napoleon's taste for wines. Napoleon liked champagne, he liked Madeira, he liked sweet wine like Bagnes, but he discovers vin de Constance, and then he really enjoys that to the point that he wanted always a glass of it a day. But when I say a glass, it's actually half of a glass, which he top up with water. Because that's the way, but he didn't do that especially for Constantia wine. He did that for any wine, except the champagne.
Let's go back, and you can hear in the background that is the police car on the island, probably looking for Ronaldo, my producer. If we have a look at just the drinking of wine, most people kind of have this perception, and St Helena knowledge, I discovered, is a bit hazy outside of St Helena. People thought, well, he's in exile, he's in some sort of prison, he's a prisoner of war. You don't tend to get to select the wine you want when you're in prison. So just give us this context of why he was in a space where choosing the wine he really liked was an option.
So that is where to define Napoleon and St Helena is very complicated, because it was not a prison, it was not an exile, it was a outcasting. Yeah, the European nation wanting Napoleon far, far away, but they could not consider him as a prisoner into our 21st century meaning of the word prison. It's not a cell, and it's not an exile where there is a voluntary decision to where you want to go. So Saint Helena was not, you have to deportation. He was deported to St Helena, where he has to adapt. So when you adapt, you look for something which helps you to adapt, and wine is one of the. So he really, in order, Napoleon did need. He could on top of his list are his books. He was craving of books, but the second one is wine, and together with food. So that is really the two things. And South Africa provided, at his great surprise, an amazing quality of wine, because not only for himself he liked the sweetest of all of the Constantia wine could provide, but also he liked red wine, which was in his books close to the claret, as far as the body. So yeah. So wine is definitely part, but in moderation, because he really he never been drunk, for example. We have no knowledge of him being drunk. It's always with moderation and always diluted with water.
So here's a man who loves to read, likes to travel, enjoys South African wine. I think I quite like Napoleon at this point of view. I'm also liking him with this South African wine and the fact that he sorts it out, or at least I think he must have, because how did he experience, how did this wine come to be on St Helena?
So the Lord Somerset, who was the first governor for the British in the Cape Province, so he had the task to supply the wine, and the main supplier was the agent Joseph Luçon, and hence the Constantia come into the picture. Luçon was not only the provider for the governor, so Lord Somerset, but also providing everything else. So he provided from cattle to the wood to everything, but he was also had vested interest into the Constantia farm. So there he sells the product of the farm he was involved with. So it's like you never better serve by yourself. So then, of course, he put on front his the farm, the product of his wine farm, and bingo, it worked.
It clearly did, because not only did Napoleon become enamored of this wine, but he helped to become probably the first influencer that Groot Constantia ever had. Danie, lovely to have you on the show, and welcome to St Helena from Constantia. First of all, very quickly, I think it's the first time we've had you on the show since the move. How are things going? How are you settling in? How is life in the Buller Gerber-sized shoes?
Well, thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me. Yeah, it's the first time I'm on your show since I've moved back to Groot Constantia. Our chairman of the board, when I just started, he said, you don't have to fill anyone's shoes, you walk your own shoes. So I'm trying to do that. Settled in, we are about halfway through the first vintage. So yeah, my nerves are settled a little bit more than it was, let's call it a month ago.
Well, you needed no greater endorsement than that of Buller. There's certainly no case of you filling shoes. You're very much your own winemaker. But I remember chatting to Buller when the news broke, and he just gave me a smile and said, yep, they've got the right guy. So if Buller thinks so, then the rest of the world surely will as well. Although he will have known, as you do, that this is a role that comes with certain responsibility and expectation, and none more so than being the guardian over the history of this brand as a whole and this particular wine that is in front of us. Tell us a little bit about this Groot Constantia, about this sweet wine, this Groot Constance, and why it is a wine that means so much to the property.
Yeah, look, it's always been, since my first stint here, I fell in love with the wine, and sort of were a bit in tears when I had to leave and I couldn't make this wine anymore. So I managed to find a backdoor in, still was involved with the property in Constantia just to be able to make sweet wine. and now back to be able to make sweet wine again. So as you said, it's a big thing to be the history around it. It's sort of a big thing that's sitting on your shoulders that you need to make sure that you need to get right year after year. No mistakes, hopefully no pressure as well. Yeah, so I'm super excited about making the wine. As you were asking a little bit about how we make it, I think one of the big differences between us and any of the other properties in Constantia is that we have the right red and white Muscat de Vranigan, Muscat Blanc, sorry. And we try and harvest them as ripe as possible. It's probably the ugliest grapes you've ever seen in your life. It's quite raisiny and dark and a little bit oxidized. And then process it. We try and extract as much sugar out of the raisins as possible. So we normally leave it on the skins for between 3 and 5 days fermentation, and then cellar it up. And hopefully in 2 years' time, we can make a decent blend out of the components.
And you're making wine, and it's part of what I love about wine's ability to time travel. You're making wine, certainly different vintage, but that's following on from the story of what Napoleon, at the end of a long day of gardening or looking back on his extraordinary career, would pour with his 3 generals and possibly his secretary and top up with a little bit of water, and that would be the end of his day. You're now carrying on the tradition of something that in 1818, 1819 was being drunk on this very property, 2,000 kilometers from Cape Town, on this tiny rock in the middle of the Atlantic.
Yeah, no, it's very exciting. You know what, recently, about 7 years ago, I had the opportunity to taste a 1854 sweet wine from Constantia. And what's very interesting for me is how very close it is to what we have today in the bottle. And I think that's also a testament about how well these wines age. And I always make a joke saying, drink anything between now and the next 100 years. I think that's a good example of how well our wines can age, especially the sweet wines that is made in that style. Yeah.
Which leads me to a really important question. It's one that many people have asked me over the years. And the very simple level is you say something about the sugar and then pretend that you've answered the question. But the kind of detail it really needs is from somebody like you, Danie. The ability to drink this wine, as you say, from 1854, drink it today, and it's still more than manageable. What's the secret? What's the magic? What are you doing at Constantia to create this wizardry?
Look, we're not hiding anything. As you mentioned, the sugar is obviously one of the big preservatives, and then obviously with the alcohol. And I think that is part of the learning curve when we started recreating these sweet wines, is to realize that you have to have a sugar of at least 140, 150 plus to be able to age the wine and to stabilize the wine over the next 100, 200 years. Yeah, so I would say the sugar is one of the main components that helps with that.
Oh, it is one of the elements, Michelle, it gives us this wine that probably offset the biggest challenge that you referred to earlier. The Burgundy didn't travel, the preservation of the sugar and alcohol. That's what got it here. What would the process have been? Would it have been pour that glass with some dinner? And if so, what would Napoleon and his team have been eating alongside their wines of Constantia?
So for the sweet wine, for the Van Constance, it was always during out of meals. It was in the middle of the morning, or when you wake up, always shopping. That is something that it never changed. But the Van Constance, he never had it with his meal, always in the middle of the afternoon or middle of the morning. He would use a plain claret type of wine, red, very similar to the Shiraz that we were talking about, Groot Constantia, this kind of body during his course. So he liked his 5 courses meal. So which is just a light veggie at the beginning, like leeks or with a vinaigrette, just plain or simple, or even lentil. Then he would have a soup, a consommé. And then he will have a roast of, so it can be chicken, it can be beef, or it can be whatever. Then he will definitely have, that is also another constant in his, the macaroni, with just plain grated cheese from South Africa, by the way. and then a dessert. He had a very strong taste. Sweeter it was for him, so to the point that he liked the bonbons and the praline. That was his best. The praline.
A man who loved his food, a man who likes wine for breakfast. I think Napoleon, we would have been Facebook friends at the least, at that time. Let's head over to our other winemaker and Matt, and we have Matt on because this story of Constantia wine, which began in no small part with Napoleon becoming this first influencer, has now sprung into being such a really important story for South African wine. Matt, I know that there are very few things you will talk about with as much enthusiasm as you do Sauvignon Blanc and the 81 different versions you make at the moment. But if anything will rival that, it certainly is the Vin de Constance. When did you fall in love with sweet wine?
No, thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me. I actually made this shirt just for you guys for the show. You can see Napoleon over there. So brilliant. Well done. Thanks for having me. Dan, in terms of this sweet wine, I mean, I started here quite a while ago. I think Danie was assistant at Groot at pretty much the same time, working under Adam Mason. And I was very fortunate to work under Adam and pick up a lot of tricks from him in terms of how he used to make the sweet wine. Adam actually started here in 2003. And Ross Gower, the winemaker before him, had recreated the sweet wine of Constantia in 1986. So Ross kind of left in 2003, and Adam started on a completely clean slate. So he recreated the Vin de Constance that Ross had created in 1986, but he had absolutely nothing to deal with or to go back and read through the notes or anything like that, because Ross was super secretive about what he did. I was fortunate to be Adam's assistant, so I was able to pick up a lot of tricks from him, learn the way that he did it. And then, with our new focus at Klein Constantia, our focus, as you mentioned, is Sauvignon Blanc, Sauvignon Blanc, Sauvignon Blanc, Sauvignon Blanc, and more Sauvignon Blanc. And there are a hell of a lot of them to go with it. But it's also for the sweet wine, so for Vin de Constance. So we've replanted all the vineyards, we've rebuilt the cellar, we've redone everything to focus on those two wines. And that's our big push at Klein Constantia at the moment. So I've always been passionate about sweet wine. I guess you start off as a kid with sweet wine at communion. And then your first wines that you start to drink are always sweet wines because they're the easiest to drink. And then you become more sophisticated and you move on to your dry style wines. And I think then you go on to your big Bordeaux reds. And eventually everyone becomes sophisticated again and they start drinking sweet wines and they absolutely love them. And we love for the Vin de Constance or a sweet wine from Constantia to be that sweet wine that they look out for in any form of the meal. The other thing that I have to say, Dan, I'd love to chat about it now, is sweet wines have become boring because they're almost too sweet. So people drink them as occasion wines, and we at Klein Constantia are trying to promote the fact that you should be drinking these wines on every occasion. You should try and have a sweet wine. As Napoleon did, maybe not for breakfast or for lunch, but at any part of the meal. It is so versatile, and if you make it well, that the sugar is not over the top, you can create a sweet wine that the sugar becomes a flavor as opposed to sucrosity. And then it pairs up with most kind of forms of meal, except for dessert. And I absolutely hate calling this a dessert wine because it's not. It's a versatile sweet wine where the sugar is just an extra added piece of flavor. Dan, over to you.
I want to ask both of you about this, and you've already gone quite far down the road. I wanted to travel in terms of the naming. We've had quite a lot of fun on the island here in St Helena yesterday with Aaron from Aaron's Tours traveling around, and we'd find a place where there was a high hill and it was called High Hill, and then we'd find a place with a green hill and it was called Green Hill, and then there'd be a straight road and it was called Straight Road. There's a very earnest simplicity to a lot of the nomenclature, and it's great because it says what's there. You got a Bellstone rock. It's a rock that sounds like a bell. One of the issues I think we've had, and I suspect both of you are dealing with this challenge as winemakers, as properties, is that the moment people hear dessert or sweet, immediately there's it's going to be cloying, it's going to be sugary, it's going to be something too sweet. And for me, one of the great triumphs of both of these wines in their different forms is that you've got something that has that savory element. It's got a multifaceted palate. There's wine that's far more subtle and far more depth than simply labeling it a sweet or dessert wine would initially suggest.
Yeah. No, for sure. I mean, that is our biggest issue at the moment is sweet is sweet, and people only drink it on Christmas Day. So it is so versatile, and I kind of promote that people have it with a starter, have it with a goat stew salad, have it with, if you're allowed to, foie gras, or at the end of the meal, cheese. I mean, I've gone as far as doing 5-course meals with Van der Constance, and we have different vintages for every pairing. And we had fillet steak, and it's probably one of the best fillet steaks I've ever had in my whole entire life. It was served with 1986 Van der Constance, so it's a different beast, but it is a big challenge that we're facing at the moment. And I think internationally, the sales of sweet wine are almost dead. You look at, there's a couple of big producers that are still doing well, but people are struggling to give sweet wine away. And, you know, there's lots of reasons for that. And I guess the one is that you drink Sauvignon Blanc, you drink white wine, you have a beer when you get there, then you drink some bubbles, some champagne, whatever it is. Then you drink your Sauvignon Blanc, you go onto your big red, and you get to the end of the meal and you can't afford the sweet wine, or you want to drink coffee in its place. So it is a big challenge. We'll see how it goes.
Monsieur Consul, there was a big smile when foie gras was mentioned with this.
Yes,
So-
because foie gras and sweet wine is working like magic.
It has to be said that you pick up behind the French accent, there's a very faint hint of a Cape Town sea point, because you've lived in Cape Town for a while. So these are wines you know, and the South African wine industry you know well. But I want to take you back to your French roots. Is the challenge that Matt speaks of, and that I'm sure in a moment Danie will speak of getting people to drink dessert or sweet style wine, is that a challenge in France?
Well, to be honest, I really have no answer to that one, because I'm not aware. I'm not in connection with that discussion. But what I think about the sweet wine, when I am in Paris, always when I am in the brasserie or cafe, and I don't feel like to have a coffee in the middle of the afternoon, I take a sweet one. And so they know exactly what I want, and so in one way, I think that has the solution. When you have a craving for a bar of chocolate, rather drink something much more civilized.
See, this is why you're a consul. It's this kind of great advice we need from our political leaders of today, Michel. I think you've got a fan there in both Matt and Danie. Danie, that challenge that Matt speaks of getting people to drink it. And for me, it's getting to drink it for the first time. And I think I go back probably 3 weeks, Danie. I opened a bottle of Groot Constantia after dinner, and literally all 6 of my guests were kind of, yeah, no, not really our kind of thing. I persuaded them all to have a little taste. The bottle was finished and they were asking for more within about 10 minutes. Once you get people to try it, they realize that what is written on the label is not quite what's inside. Is that a fair assessment of where we are and the challenge we have with getting this wine into the hands of more people?
No, yeah, definitely. I agree with 100% with both of you. Matt was mentioning with a steak, he's had a pairing with a steak once. I think one of the best Groot Constantias I've had was made with ostrich steak. So definitely have it with anything. I always love coming home, start off with a bottle of sweet. The problem with starting off with sweet, though, is it's quite difficult to move over to a dry wine after that. It's just so powerful and overpowering that anything after that normally tastes a little bit dull. Yeah, 100% agree. It is a bit of a challenge. We tend to find people buy our wines mostly for special occasions, that they want to open it or age it for a long time. But it is definitely a wine that I think is brilliant to have with a meal, and even just by itself. It's a brilliant thing to have. You mentioned Napoleon had it in the mornings, maybe a little bit early in the morning for me, but after lunch is normally a good time as a pick me up with the sugar. I think helps a little bit to get you going for the rest of the afternoon rather than the coffee.
Well, remember, of course, that this wine is from South Africa. St Helena is 2 hours behind. So lunchtime South Africa, mid-morning St Helena. I think it all makes sense. Danie, we've got 2 very contrasting wines here in terms of the colour, and you'll be able to see that quite clearly. One issue is vintage. Yours is a 2017. Matt is a 2020. But I suspect there are elements to the grape beyond just simple vintage. Give us the inside guide to this 2017 Groot Constantia. Why are we seeing the color that we do, and what goes in to making this wine quite as good as it is? And I can say with great authority that it is exceptional.
So yes, from here I can see which class is the Groot Constantia and which one is the Wiener Constantia. So the main difference for me is the fact that we've got red and white Muscat de Groningen. We've got about the farm is about 35% planted with red and 65% white Muscat de Groningen. Obviously, vintages differ quite a bit. How the final blend will be put together, it can vary anything between 15%. I don't think we've ever gone 35%. So really over 20% of the red Muscat. But that little bit is just enough to give you that color that is slightly orange, a bit more on the red side. Look, I always find that the red Muscat de Groningen tend to ripen a little bit earlier, so you tend to get that component quite sweet compared to the white component that we normally harvest a couple of weeks after. We try and keep these components separate to be able to blend to get to the right flavor profile that we want in the end. 2017, I think that wine sugar was about 157, if I'm correct. So not quite as sweet as some of the other vintages we've made, but yeah, it's pretty much to the very to the standard flavor profile. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's test it with the heir apparent to Napoleon's palate, Monsieur Consul, santé. So we shall pretend we are in the court of Napoleon in 1819. Well, I'll let you gather your thoughts. I'm going to go back to what I said a moment ago, which is, yes, it's a sweet wine. It's 157 grams of sugar. There is no doubt that there is sweetness here, but sweetness is not the only characteristic. And while it's the defining one, for me, it's not overwhelmingly so, because there is such an array of different flavors, from little pockets of nutmeg and little pockets of savory just running through the palate. There's a lot of balance to this wine, which I love. What does Napoleon's custodian of wine in 2024 think?
No, I mean, that's what I said, Dan. It's you can drink it very often with a group of French people who want, because we have that wine on the shop here, and they want to share a bottle, and it's always about 4 o'clock, which is now. He really made it up on its own. It's like, as I said to you, it's a sweet moment on the middle of the afternoon instead of a coffee, and it's so amazing because that flavor, you keep it in your mouth for the next half an hour with no problem. It is really, it's pleasurable, take it that way.
It does linger very happily indeed. And you mentioned that we've been inside, we've had a look at the shop, we've had a look at the cellar. There is Groot Constantia available here. Is that something that tourists know of? Are they aware of the story? Are they coming here knowing a bit about the wine, occasionally wanting to try it and to buy it?
That is something we want to develop before the COVID, just a year before COVID, and the COVID put a stop on that one quite badly, but now we will try to reestablish that. So definitely next month I'm going to Groot Constantia, trying to start again that, because there is the garden, as you've seen, is a very pleasant place. So you have a bench, you take your bottle, you have like we are, and it's very pleasurable, and it's a way to appreciate sweet wine in the middle of the day. You don't need necessarily food with it. It's just enough.
And if the consul, the French consul on the entire island, gives you that advice, you should be taking it. Let's go back to Matt. Matt, you have got the slightly paler iteration. So if this is the South African on the beach in Cape Town, then this would be the English taxi driver who's only been on holiday for a week or two. It's younger, certainly, but there are other elements that change it. Talk us through your approach, what we've got in the glass, and what from 2020 we can be expecting.
Thanks, Dan. So in terms of color, as Danie mentioned, it's Muscat de Groningen, it's the white varietal of it. If we look back in terms of the old varietals that would have gone into the sweet wine of Constantia, the varietals, the cultivars that were documented that would have been used in those days was Muscat Le Petit Grand or Muscat de Groningen. It was Semillon, it was Chenin, and it was Pontac. So the reason why the Muscat de Groningen works here And we have to mention, guys, that it's not a noble-led harvest. It's not a botrytized wine. And that's one of our greatest points of difference is it's made from raisins. It's sun-dried on the vine. So we're not making botrytis. We're not trying to copy other famous wine regions of the world. We're trying to make a unique wine that is recreated from that incredible old sweet wine that Constantia made in the old days. So in terms of style, the reason for us picking just the white muscat is firstly the Muscat de Frontignan itself has got very thick skins, and it allows it to resist all the rots and everything that happens throughout the very long raisening season or ripening season. And then we go out and we pick riper bunches that have raisins on. So that's where the lighter color comes in. The other thing that we've done in terms of striving for the perfection of Van der Constans is we've tried to pinpoint the perfect point. So we talk about two forms of balance, and the one form of balance is the balance that you taste. It's the sensorial taste where you get the sugar, you get the alcohol, and you get the acidity going into it. So we harvest this wine for up to 3 months. There's 30 different batches that go into it. Every single batch has its own unique kind of end goal with it. So we look at the earlier stuff for high acidity, the late stuff for very high sugar. 30 different batches is then blended together during the fermentation process to bring out that balance between sugar, alcohol, and acidity. And that's what brings out the dryness to it. So if you can get the pH right, a lot of sugar right, they kind of counteract each other. They also stop the fermentation. So we spoke about sugar being a preservative. We use sugar as a tool to stop the ferment naturally without cooling or without adding sulfur or without filtration. So that's quite a nice point of difference there. So that's the first point of balance. But the other point of balance that I have to get to is the point of balance between primary, secondary, and tertiary flavors. So primary flavors is where it's very light, very clear, very aromatic from the fermentation. It's almost just lychees and Turkish delight and everything. And then with oxidation and with time, it evolves to a point that it gets to secondary. And then if you leave it for a very long time, it goes into tertiary flavors. So secondary is kind of on the white muscat, goes to that very light gold, almost citrus kind of color. And then if you leave it for longer, it goes into that tertiary color, which is that toffee, darker, oxidized, more browner in color. So in the old days, we used to age this wine for up to 4.5 to 5 years in barrel, depending on the vintage. And then it would go to those tertiary flavors. So it would be that very dark mahogany color. We've brought it back to a point that we age for 1.5 years in 500 liter, 60% New York barrels. And at that point, you get that evolution from primary to secondary flavors. And then we want to allow the wine to age for a bit longer without it oxidizing. So we've got a cellar built full of massive food rows, so 4,500 liter big wooden vats that have got very thick staves. And those kind of prevent that oxidation from happening, but they still allow that integration of oak through that period of time. So you're kind of sticking the wine into a time capsule. You're preserving that very nice, fresh flavor with the lighter kind of golden colors, but you're still getting evolution of flavors. So it does stay a lot lighter for longer. And it's taken us many, many years to kind of perfect that. And I feel like we're finally at that point that you are getting that balance between, both those two forms of balance I've just spoken about. We've seen that this wine, and looking at the old sweet wines of Constantia, you can see a lot of them have gone very dark and they almost pigment out to that lighter color again. We're seeing that with some of the older vintages of Van der Constans. In 1986, it's just toffee in color, but it is starting to get a bit lighter. A lot of these wines also after 5 years get dark, and they do kind of stabilize after a bit of oxidation. Long answer, sorry, Dan. For the geeks in the room.
No, it is comprehensive and it is enlightening, and it leads into the judgment. Let's see if this can add to the consul's list of breakfast wines. Very different one. Stop there once again. And again, while you compose your thoughts on it, Michelle, I remember quite distinctly, and My apologies if she's watching this, but leaving my mother alone with a bottle of this that I'd literally just opened and came back 20 minutes later from going down to the store to get something. And she was adamant that my then 6-year-old daughter had drunk it all. She had a big smile and had to sit down because it's got that. Once it's opened, it's very difficult to stop, and it applies to both of these. It is a different wine, but it appears to be one that's also put a smile on your face.
No. I mean, it's a different one in the taste on so many levels. One is like this one. I think is sweeter. The second one, and the Klein Constantia, which it's more body, but it's still an amazing moment. It's so, and especially we are at the right time for that. So end of the day, it's relaxing. But one thing I never knew about, maybe you can answer me, how you rather serve them at the room temperature like we do now, or do we need to chill it?
Well, let me go back here. Let's jump back to Danie. And Danie, I preempt this, and I'm going to remove names to avoid any legal repercussions. But a certain owner of a large collection of wine that he had inherited from his father looked to sell all of it because he didn't like any wine, with the exception, and I still get cold shivers when I recall this story, with the exception of the vintage Chem, which he'd like to pour over vanilla ice cream. God help us if we ever get to that particular stage. We won't be using any of this to pour over vanilla ice cream, but we may well be having it at the end of the meal. We may be having it sitting outside an historic home on the island of St Helena. When we do for you, Danie, what's the ideal temperature, and I know we've alluded to, you mentioned some ostrich fillets, there was some fillet steak from Matt as well. Are there any other particular dishes, once we've got the temperature right, that you think would bring out even more magic from this already splendid wine, Danie?
Cool. Yeah, so I personally prefer my sweet wines a little bit chilled. So around about 13 degrees Celsius, that's where you normally get the most flavors coming out without, and keep it fresh and easy to drink and drink more of it. I mentioned earlier the ostrich steak. That still is one of my top pairings that I want to do. And if you want to go a step further, you can even make a reduction with the sweet wine to pour over the ostrich steak. That is quite a nice thing to do. And then you can probably have it with most meals. It's normally quite interesting to throw people a little bit when you start off with a sweet wine, sweetened with a starter as a food pairing, but anything up to the dessert with cheeses and nuts. I personally prefer not having it with any food by itself. I feel it is a meal by itself almost. Rather have that in between your meals and freshen up for the last course that you would have.
Nods of approval there, Monsieur Consul. You agree with that one?
I totally agree with that. It's I think maybe with the exception of something like very fat, like the foie gras or something like that. But during the middle of the day, and you were talking about how to make people rediscover the sweet wine, because unfortunately in the English language you say sweet wine to designate that. So in French we don't say vin sucré, we don't say that. So we name it. So and then it's easier to actually make it. But the wording need to be changed. Not sweet wine, because sweet wine is almost like negative. It's
very much so. We are getting valuable advice from our consul here today. So Matt, Danie, your job is to find us a new name from 2025 to get rid of the misconceptions here. Trying this, and again, I think drinking these on their own is fabulous. My preferred way is I will have some of the Groot Constantia, and then I'll have the Van der Constance, and then I'll go back to the other. And for me, that's a great meal. But if I were to eat something with it, I think they're preparing some crayfish and lobster for us at the Mantis this evening, where we're staying in Jamestown, where Ian and Sinead and Itai and Sandile and Declan and the team have been looking after us splendidly. Might see if we can smuggle a taste of this through with the crayfish. But if not, what else to have with it? And give us your take on the temperature, Matt, for you of this wine to get the best out of it.
So Dan, I'm on my way. I heard lobster and I heard sweet wine. I heard St Helena. It sounds fantastic. My ideal serving temperature is much like Danie's, 12 degrees Celsius. the colder the better. The sugar is less evident. As soon as it gets a little bit warmer, you pick up that sugar, so it helps to balance out that sugar ratio. In terms of naming it sweet wine, Noble Late Harvest, whatever it is when it comes to sweet wines, dessert wines, I guess. The nice thing with us, I mean, Van der Constance is Van der Constance. So we've taken all of that off the label. It's just called Van der Constance in the label. So we shouldn't have to talk about it being sweet. I mean, people will discover that when they find it. And they'll also kind of know that it's going to be a little bit sweet. In terms of pairings, we've said it many times, foie gras, foie gras, foie gras, and more foie gras. And if you can't get it or it's frowned upon, I would definitely do it with a cheese platter at the end of the meal. I absolutely love cheese and sweet wine. And you have to get the right kind of cheese. I mean, you could have a full-on conversation or debate about which cheese should go with which wine. But it is a match made in heaven for me.
But not, whispers our consul very firmly. All cheese. Quel fromage, Monsieur Consul?
A very, as I said, very highly fat cheese. You know, if you take, I mean, a maroilles, for example, is a sweet wine.
Glorious.
That's glorious.
All right, we've had a number of people chatting to us on the show today. Big thank you to Andrew Woolgar, who sent through a long message, which you can read up on the site at the moment. But I was a terrific supporter of all wine, as long as it comes from South Africa. Josephine Prieur, throwing back to some, I think it was 1992, Van der Constance she had with Ross Gower, and some very fond memories there. Merci bien, Josephine. Lovely to have you on the show from France today. And then a message from my dear mum saying the only person you should be suing is her for disparaging her character. Of course, her character is flawless, and she didn't say that my daughter drank the wine. She just drank it all herself quite happily and didn't bat an eyelid. We're drinking wine that I know she loves. I know so many people do love as well. Before we go back to our winemakers, just to wrap up, tell me a little bit about the wine culture today. If we go back to 1815 through 1821, Constantia headlining along with some of the Madeira that Ronaldo, my Portuguese producer, assures me is the best wine in the world. I've yet to meet anyone who agrees. There was a bit of champagne coming through, but it really was Constantia that had an impact at that time. Fast forward 200 years since we said goodbye to Napoleon. Is there a wine drinking culture on the island of St Helena?
No. On Napoleon's time, don't forget, it was mostly a military base, and every soldier were allowed of what would be the equivalent of 1.25 liters a day of wine, so they had to be provided with. So it was a standard quantity of a soldier. So then there was a culture of wine, but I can't guarantee the quality of the wine. So that is for sure. But may I take the opportunity of this talk to ask you a professional question about the idea of Napoleon putting. I really dislike the idea of him putting half water into his would something that somebody would do today.
Well, let's come back to Danie today. I think you might get some people who add a little touch of water if they're giving wine to younger people, or they're just not really wine drinkers. But if you go back, and again, we'll get Danie's thoughts now, but 200 years ago, it might have been that perhaps the wine needed some addition. If you go back even further, you'll find, for instance, my wife's Greek ancestors were adding everything from feta to fish to bits of seawater, because the wine generally was fairly horrible. 200 years ago, I suspect it was considerably better. But let's find out, Danie, that addition of water, was that merely that, much like myself, Napoleon was watching his figure and a dedicated athlete? Or was there another reason it might have been adding a flash of water to his wine of Constantia from 100 years ago?
Yeah, Dan, I think if you're having a bottle a day, every day, you probably want to dilute it down a little bit. Me personally, I'm happy with ice or water in any wine except for the sweet wine. That's the one that I think you don't want to add any water to. You want to have that full layers of flavors that can come to you. But otherwise, whatever makes you happy, in my opinion.
All right, Matt, let's jump over to you quickly. Just a look ahead. You've already mentioned the Sauvignon Blanc and the Vin de Constance being such a big focus. If we dial down into that Vin de Constance, yes, you are making it with great enthusiasm, but as we've all known from today's show, it's a challenging market that you are working with, and so you could quite happily just devote your time to making even more Sauvignon Blanc and working on other elements. I know that you won't. How do you see the future of not just Vin de Constance, but sweet wine, as we'll call it for now? Once you've got the new name for it with Danie next year, we'll change it. But this style of wine, is it something that offers a flicker of hope? Can we see a brighter future in South Africa and beyond for the wines of this style from South Africa?
Oh, Dan, we can see a huge change already. I mean, from 2017 or 2018, I can't remember, we joined Le Place de Bordeaux. So we were one of the first international wines to sell the Vin de Constance on the Bordeaux platform with all the great wines of the world. And we've constantly been one of the top performing wines on that platform, far exceeding any of our wildest expectations. So Vin de Constance has probably been one of the top performing sweet wines internationally in the world recently. We're competing with all the great chateaus of the world. And the goal for us at Klein Constantia is when people say, what is that great sweet wine of the world? Everyone's going to say Chateau d'Yquem, but we're starting to get people saying, what about Vin de Constance? It is getting served in all the top restaurants in the world, in all the top 2 Michelin or 3 Michelin star restaurants. So we have a great following. We have the sommeliers absolutely love the wine. It's one of those best kept secrets that everyone knows. So fortunately, the wine's got a beautiful, if you talk about the sweet wine of Constantia, it's got a beautiful past. We've got a fantastic history that we love to brag about, all these stories that we've already spoken about. It's great to get us a footstep into any door, but the future of this wine is more important to us. So onwards and upwards, we are anticipating, putting more and more effort into the Vin de Constance with that goal of achieving 100 points or creating one of the greatest sweet wines of the world. We're almost there. The only problem that we have is we just lack a couple 100 years of marketing that, the old world seems to have. And, we talk about the old world tongue in cheek because the Constantia wine farm that was created in 1685 is older than a lot of the old world producers. The only issue that we had is we stopped producing wine from 1885 until 1986. So, it's a tough situation to be in, but we've got a great history. The future is as important as what the history actually was with Vin de Constance. Dan, over to you.
It's good to hear that sort of positivity and enthusiasm. Danie, wrapping up with you, there's been a lot of very positive sentiment about the Constantia wine story in the little time I've been on the island since Saturday, not just from our consul, but from people who talk about it and talk about how St Helena and the wine of Constantia have this proud shared history. What would your message as winemaker at Groot Constantia be to the many people I know who are watching the show today in St Helena, for which we're very grateful, but also those who are here on the island and watching this show, knowing that there is this old link?
Yeah, look, I need to add on to Matt. When I started here 2009, we had 1.5 hectares of sweet wine planted on the farm. And when I came back in 2023, we had close to 7 hectares of sweet wine planted on the farm. So, I mean, that just shows how much we have upped in production and how this portfolio is just, the category is just growing from year to year. Going away messages, thank you very much for everyone supporting us. It's obviously brilliant to be part of a farm where people want to celebrate the farm, want to celebrate the history of the farm, and want to come here and celebrate it on the farm. And not just on the farm, even just the valley, the whole Constantia Valley as a whole.
It's a perfect way to wrap things up, not just with our two winemakers, but also with you, Michel, as consul. It's been lovely to share this afternoon with you, share some lovely wine with you.
Very civilized.
It is indeed. And I mean, you've been here a fair stretch now. This is where you call home. It's an enchanting part of the world, as I've discovered very, very quickly indeed. This is a small, but we think quite important part of the story. But it's part of the story of an island that's come to mean so much to you personally.
Oh yes, I mean this island, it's my life. I'm here since I was 19. So, and but the quality of life and again, the sweet wine it's a kind of drink you don't eat being stressed and in speed. And that is two things we don't know on St Helena is speeding or stressing. So here we are, Constantia wine.
Brings a lazy afternoon on the island of St Helena to an end. Thank you to all of you watching South Africa, St Helena, around the world, Andy in America, be it Josephine in France, be it Helen and Philip watching in Hollywood in Northern Ireland. Hopefully today has either given you a little more understanding of the wines of Constantia of this style, if you already knew them, and if not, has introduced you to both the wines themselves, but also the rich history that surrounds those first wines that arrived here and found favor with Napoleon and that have since gone on to establish themselves as some of the world's great examples. Our challenge through the show and through Matt and through Danie is to find a new name, to be rid of the sweet and dessert wine labels and to give it something that's a little more accurate, a little more meaningful, and a little more powerful in the marketing story that needs to accompany the greatness of these wines. So Matt, Danie, guys, thank you both very, very much indeed. Good luck with whatever remains of harvest, and from there going into the bottling of the 2024 vintages. These wines, when they come out in a few years' time from this vintage, we'll try them very happily then. And until then, both the consul and myself will be raising a final couple of glasses to you both, to the history of Groot Constantia here, to the future of Groot Constantia and of Van de Constance, and to both of you continuing to deliver some quite wonderful South African wine. So thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thank you.
And Michel, to you and your team, merci bien, monsieur. That was a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing the history
Yeah.
and Napoleon's love of wine. And I'd like to think you'd approve of us doing exactly what we're doing now.
Absolutely, with or without water.
There we go. Join us again on the show on Thursday when we'll have a little more of wine from the island of St Helena. Look out for next Monday with a very special show on Semillon, and through the rest of the month we've got some more adventures coming. To keep an eye out. Between now and then, though, if you have the opportunity, be South Africa or elsewhere, grab a bottle of what we know reluctantly is sweet wine, preferably South African. Doesn't have to be. Whatever it is, I think if you're not familiar with it, you'll discover there's a lot more joy and a lot less sweetness than you might imagine. This has been a very special edition of Dan Really Likes Wine, brought to you by Norman Goodfellows from Napoleon's home on the island of St Helena. A big thank you to St Helena Tourism, to the Mantis Hotel, and to the team at Airlink, as well as Farm Lodge will be there later this week. And if you haven't yet, come to St Helena. It's a magical place. Goodbye.